Hello, C3RF members across the nation. It's great to have you on board again for another session of In Hot. Remember, In Hot is a fighter pilot term. It denotes the fact that a pilot has fully armed and loaded aircraft and he's ready to roll in on target. He's cleared in hot, and today we're going to be in hot on the subject of the Ukrainian situation and how it impacts Canada. And we're very, very fortunate to have with us today a very able wingman in the form of Salim Mansur. Salim is a patron, I'm very glad to say, of C3RF. And if I can share a screen here for a sec, we can see that Salim was born in Calcutta, India, arrived in Canada, worked his way through school, a longtime resident of London, Ontario. He's Professor Emeritus at the University of Western Ontario, where he taught for over 3 decades. He's the author of several very popular books, including The Quran Problem and Islamism, along with The Delectable Lie, a liberal repudiation of multiculturalism. He is a consistent and conservative voice on foreign affairs and other aspects of public policy. He's been called to testify before the Canadian Parliament numerous times, and he's an academic consultant for the Center of Security Policy in Washington, D.C. In Canada, he was the vice president and founding member of the Council of Muslims Facing Tomorrow, a group championing freedom, human rights, and gender equality. So with that, Salim, a real honor to have you on board. And I've been watching over the last little while. You've been talking about the Ukraine, and I've seen you make an analogy to Milos some 2,400 years ago when there was a Peloponnesian War and Sparta was at war with Athens. And could you explain that Milos analogy and maybe how it fits with today's Ukraine situation?
Yeah, thank you for having me, first of all, Russ. It's a real pleasure to be with you as your wingman, just as he's your
wingman. Yes, you're my wingman.
Your wingman on this program of yours. Yeah, it's a real pleasure. As you would know, Russ, given your own background and your interests in military history and strategy and all of that, which is part of both as a professional person, but a continuing interest, Thucydides' book, The Peloponnesian War, has been a textbook for people for almost 2,000 years or more. I mean, that is, people who have studied and looked at military history, who have been concerned about political and legal philosophy. And in terms of international politics, where all of these things intersect and come together, and where the issues of ethics are right at the center of the issue of geostrategic politics played out by competing actors, Thucydides' thoughts and book is of abiding interest to all of us. And in there is that dialogue, the Melian dialogue, which is what I was citing, Milos, the island of Milos, that was caught between Athens and Sparta. I mean, the whole opening of the book is the famous lines, if I can paraphrase it, you know, the war became inevitable with the growth of Athenian power and the fear it stoked in Sparta. And so, you know, there you see the dynamics in a 2-actor framework. It can be a multipolar framework, you know. I mean, the whole situation that led to, in that alliance system that was forged before 1914, you know, and that sparked it, and it led to the war that came thereafter and the destruction that followed. So the Melian dialogue is when the Athenians, this was in the midst of the war was a long drawn out war. And after the end of the war, the face of ancient Greece changed. But during the war, about halfway point, the Athenians, they sent a delegation to Milos. Milos had tried to maintain its neutrality between Athens and Sparta, but leaning towards Sparta. The Athenians sent a delegation to indicate to them and to give them an ultimatum that they have to make a choice, and the choice has to be clear that they have to join the Athenian League. And the millions, their representatives, they argued for fair play and justice, and all of those issues were raised in this dialogue. It's a fascinating chapter in the book. And then the Athenians left with a sort of a final warning, and if you give me the permission, I'll just quote the critical sentence, that comes into play all the time. And that is what the Athenian delegation says at the end. It said that you're talking about justice and fair play and so on and so forth. The standard of justice depends on the equality of power to compel, and that in fact, the strong do what they have the power to do, and the weak accept what they have to accept. And you can put this in the context of many situations. And as far as I know, you were part of the coalition that went into the first Gulf War, and just put yourself in the situation. Kuwait and Iraq. Kuwait is Milos, and Iraq is Athens,
Yep.
And at the end of the Iran-Iraq war, Iraq sends the delegation that you have to shape up and join us, or we will eliminate you.
Yep.
And then comes the big powers to eliminate Iraq, and this is played out over and over again. And the lesson is, in the case of Ukraine, whatever be the history, and the history is always, as Adam Smith famously said, there's a lot of ruin in history. So there's a lot of ruin. And whatever it is, at this moment in time, as the situation evolves, Russia is the big power over there. And Ukraine is the buffer state between Russia, the heartland, or part of the heartland of Eurasia, and the other power on the other side of the buffer state is Europe, the continent of Europe, NATO, EU, and so on. And the situation is that Ukrainians have to be very careful, as Athenians instructed Milos, of the decisions they're going to make. And you cannot make a decision when the great power with whom you're tied up for centuries, and then you start poking them, the great power will react. And that's the play that we are witnessing.
So I think, in the Ukrainian situation, we're kind of looking at a situation where we have Russia as Athens, and the European, the West as Sparta. Initially, when we had, I wound up in the Persian Gulf War in 1991 because basically the Soviet Union collapsed, and there was a whole reorganization, a whole restructuring going on, and it made it that whole check and balance that was in place between the Soviets and the West, primarily America. It disintegrated, and now America basically had free reign to do what it wanted to do on the world scene, and they did. They organized a huge coalition to go in and take out, kick Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. Now that same situation, that same reorganization in the Ukrainian perspective, what we saw was NATO, or the West, upon the collapse of the Soviet Union. They basically made a promise to Russia. They said, I think the quote goes something like, "You can bank on the fact that NATO will not advance 1 centimeter eastward towards the Russian Federation," and that gave everybody a sense of pause, a sense of ease. Okay, we're not going to take advantage of Russia. But I think in the following years we saw a case where that all changed. And in the early 1990s, maybe under Clinton, in around that time frame, we saw NATO advancing, and we saw it subsume 14 extra nations. And we saw, I think in 2008, it made a specific comment that NATO would open its arms to Ukraine in 2008. And that just set everything going and put everything in process here, because that I think that speaks to your prodding or poking the bear. So we have Russia's national interests on one side, and we have this play going on the other side where the West is kind of putting a carrot out to Ukraine, saying, come on over here. And I think Russia took that very seriously. How seriously do you think Russia takes it? How far are they prepared to go?
Well, we know from the documents that are available in the public domain. I mean, for instance, you're mentioning 2008. In 2008, the American ambassador, Bush was the president at that time, and his Secretary of State was Condoleezza Rice. Condoleezza Rice is supposed to be in her career a Russian expert, and the ambassador was William Burns, and it is now has been revealed that in the documents that are available, that one of the last memorandum that William Burns sent to Condoleezza Rice, he pointed out in no uncertain term, without any ambiguity, the reddest of the red line for Moscow is Ukraine. Well, where is William Burns right now? He's the director of CIA. And yes, going back to 1991, and your own, experience with that, at the hotspot, Soviet Union was still on the map. Gorbachev was still the leader of Soviet Union. That came about at the end of Soviet Union. The collapse of Soviet Union came about after the Gulf War, at the end of 1991.
That's
1991 December, early 1992 January, when Boris Yeltsin took over and Gorbachev stepped down, and Soviet Union was basically written off, and Russian Federation, the new structure, started taking place. So just a couple of minutes on this matter. When the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, another counterfactual thought one might have. If Gorbachev was not committed to, as he had become committed to after the Helsinki conference with Ronald Reagan, where Ronald Reagan discussed with him SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, and Gorbachev realized, and his people realized after that basically the game was over. There would be no basis of maintaining a bipolar balance with the United States in the direction where the United States was going to go with the SDI. And the issue then became for Gorbachev and others how to manage their glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost, the opening of Soviet Union to Western Europe, or Europe, the divided Europe, and perestroika was the restructuring of the Soviet economy and the internal dynamics of the Soviet demand for democracy that was always there. The pressure was always there and was now coming very swiftly on the surface, and the fall of Berlin Wall was an indicator of that. Well, they could have stopped it. Honecker in East Germany, the Stasi, they could have been brutal as they had been brutal in Hungary, 56, in Czechoslovakia, 68, 69, but they held back, and they held back in Poland. So we have to be very cautious about how the end came about. And the end came about in a remarkable sense peacefully. There was no outbreak of war,
Right.
Soviet Union conceded. And that point was brought home by George Kennan in the aftermath of all of these things. In 1991, again, to remind your listeners, Russ, the president of and leaders of all the major powers in Europe, that is Britain, France, and Germany. In Britain, there was John Majors. Maggie Thatcher had stepped down after the internal coup, one might say, of the Conservative Party. John Majors was the prime minister. The president of France was Francois Mitterrand, and the chancellor of Germany that oversaw the unification was Helmut Kohl. And all of them in the private meetings with Gorbachev and in the public meeting that took place when Gorbachev visited Europe, and subsequently Boris Yeltsin, they said exactly what you cited a little moment ago, that there will be no expansion of NATO 1 centimeter east of Germany. And furthermore, as a military man, I would emphasize that Helmut Kohl and his foreign minister Genscher, in their private conversation with Gorbachev and repeated with Boris Yeltsin, pointed out that the East German territory, which was now being unified with West Germany, there would be no deployment of NATO forces on East German territory, which then borders upon Poland.
That's right.
So these were all understood. They were not written down in any treaty negotiation, but the treaty negotiation came with the Budapest Conference and Memorandum of 1994, in which Bill Clinton brought Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan to give up their nuclear weapons, which were Soviet weapons deployed on their territory, and Ukraine had the largest deployment, somewhere around about 2,000 medium range, short range, and ICBMs, to give them up, to return it to Moscow. And in return, the guarantee signed by Moscow, United Kingdom and United States, the three nuclear power countries, to guarantee the security of these states, Belarus, Ukraine, but all of them has been abandoned. And after the Budapest Memorandum in 1997, Poland was brought into NATO. And then with that began the domino effect of all the other European countries of the Warsaw Pact. Warsaw Pact, by the way, was disbanded by Moscow, and NATO, that was constructed to contain the eastern part, that is the result of World War II, the Iron Curtain, that in the famous speech of Churchill, that had descended from the Baltic to the Adriatic. To keep that line was NATO construction, and Moscow responded by Warsaw Pact. But Warsaw Pact was disbanded. And then began the thing. And this is what George Kennan, who was in a sense, the godfather of containment. He wrote the famous document. He was the ambassador in Moscow. He had served during the war as the consul general in Moscow and later as an ambassador. He said, in his watching all of these things happening, he said, I think it is the beginning of a new Cold War. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely, and it will affect their policies.
Wasn't that prophetic?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is a tragic mistake, and I can read this whole passage. He was dismayed, he was despairing, and he was. This is what he said. Let me read this final thing. He said, and Russia's democracy is as far advanced. He's talking in late 1990s, is as far advanced, if not further, as any of these countries, which is the Warsaw Pact countries, we have just signed up to defend from Russia. It shows so little understanding of Russian history and Soviet history. Of course, there's going to be a bad reaction from Russia, and then the NATO expanders will say that we always told you that that is how Russians are, but this is just wrong. Yep. So in this process of the last 30 years, and you're absolutely right, as you point out, that in 1990, at the end of 1991, America emerged as a unipolar power. And the definition of unipolar power was given both by President George Herbert Walker Bush, 41, in a speech that he gave to a joint session of Congress in September 1991. Looking back, the irony, even to the date, September 11, 1991, and we know a decade later what happened in New York and Washington. And George Bush in that session pointed out that we have laid the foundation of a new world order. And his defense secretary Dick Cheney, who later on becomes the vice president for his son, George Bush 43rd, Dick Cheney then defined it. He said, it will be a rule-based order in which we will make the rules and you will follow the rules. And if you don't follow the rule, there will be consequences. And so now we know 30 years later, what is this rule-based order? This is the globalism that is being pushed through the UN agenda and the World Economic Forum. So that's one side of the equation. Mm-hmm. This whole issue of NATO right into the doorstep of Moscow is the other side of the equation. And you can see all of this was understood that this was going to happen. The question is why it is happening. And there will be competing answers, because now the globalist media, which is basically Western media, including Canadian media, they are out in full force to paint Mr. Putin as the Darth Vader.
It's crazy. The propaganda, the noise that the Western media is making is incredible. And I just like to. It seems to me that there's another analogy going on here. And that is, you mentioned the fact that the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 pulled back all of those nuclear weapons that were Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Belarus, back into Russia to create a buffer. And NATO, for its part, made that promise that we're not going to advance a centimeter. It seems like we had the beginnings there of what could have been a reconciliation instead of any kind of a confrontation. And I'm seeing an analogy here with the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, when we had the situation where NATO had established missile systems in Turkey. Khrushchev reacted. He says, "Okay, if you want to do that, I'll put missile systems in Cuba." And we had that confrontation there that happened. And at the end of the day, both sides had to take a step back and pull missiles out of Cuba and pull missiles out of Turkey. So it seems like that kind of an opportunity is being missed here. And my own personal experience, this is just my own personal opinion, but from what I saw while I was in the military over this time period in the 90s, was I remember we came back from the Persian Gulf War, and it was peace in our time. It was all militaries were going to experience, the phrase was the peace dividend. And I was back in NDHQ, National Defense Headquarters in Ottawa, and I was trying to procure weapon systems as a requirements officer. And it was tough because there was no money, because the peace dividend was biting hard into the Canadian military, and it was biting hard in the American military too, because I had a lot of contacts I used to use in the American military system for procurement. And I had the real distinct impression that that big military industrial complex south of the border was getting a bit frustrated because it wasn't churning out the profits like it used to. And it needs, in my opinion, it needs an enemy. It needs a boogeyman. It needs a bad boy in the block that needs to be taken care of. And then I noticed, in 1995, mid 90s, we had the Kosovo thing. Okay, we started bombing Belgrade. Then we had offers of NATO to the Ukraine. Just continually, playing upon this thing where we're working against an enemy, trying to almost reconstruct the old Soviet Union is what I saw taking place. But and now we're at the situation. We're in a situation where we poked and prodded, and now we've got the Russian Federation saying that, I think in Putin's 28 February speech, he said a red line has been crossed. He said it. He said it out out in front of the world. The red line's been crossed, and he was not going to. It didn't seem to me like he had any mind to back down from securing his national interests, his security interests.
Well, Russ, put it in again. You began with Thucydides and Milos, so let's put this in the historical context. So let's have that broader frame that we are scratching. The Cuban Missile Crisis, exactly 60 years ago this year. I mean, there are two anniversaries this year. Mm-hmm. February 2022 was the 50th anniversary of Nixon's visit to Beijing with Mao, that opened up that relationship, And I recall that in context of the Ukraine war, I put it in terms of Milos and Thucydides, because my generation paid a horrific price as Milos caught between the great powers in the geopolitics. So, as the African saying goes, when elephants fight, the grass gets ruined. And if you are in the grass, you get ruined,
Yeah.
So people forget, what is happening in distant land. I mean, now everybody is an expert on Ukraine by reading the propaganda media of the globalists. And the history is missing, the context is missing, and the fact that the little people are just the pawns in the hands of great powers. So that was a situation in 1972 when Americans used Pakistan as the platform for the secret connection to Beijing. Islamabad was the stopover for Kissinger doing the preparation for Nixon's visit. And in return, Pakistan was given a blanket approval, that is the military rulers of Pakistan, to do whatever they wanted to do, because Pakistan was caught up in its own domestic problem. And that led to the Pakistani military using full force on East Pakistan, where I was a young adult, I was in my teenage years, which then exploded into a civil war, into a genocide. 10 million people, that is 1 in 5 poor people of that part of the world in East Pakistan, a small country, far removed from everything else in the world, a remote place, became refugees in India. And that led to then a confrontation and a war between India and Pakistan, in which the American Sixth Fleet moved into the Bay of Bengal, Soviet Union moved their forces with, or gave their support to India, and so on and so forth. It was a mess. But it was a mess that the small people paid for, like me, my family, my friends, and people all around me. But the Cuban Missile Crisis, again, brings back history. And John Kennedy referred to that in his proclamation or in his announcement. That is the Monroe Doctrine.
Yes.
18th century 3, President James Monroe, one of the founding fathers and the 5th president of the United States, declared the Monroe Doctrine that no European power can enter the Western Hemisphere and engage with their politics that is detrimental to the United States, and the United States will take action. Remember, 1823 is just less than 12 years after the 1812 war, when the British went down from Ontario into Washington and burned the White House.
That's right. That's right. They were serious about the Monroe Doctrine. And I believe Kennedy, push come to shove, he would have launched. There's no doubt in my mind that he was prepared to live by the Monroe Doctrine of in 1962.
Well, look, I mean, again, I don't know how many Canadian students or Canadian politicians know that our founding fathers were responding, if I may use the word shotgun marriage, it was a shotgun marriage to create this dominion in 1867 as the Civil War came to an end in America. And they were extremely worried that the Americans are now going to take action because Britain had supported the Confederate powers. So where would the action, if the Americans moved to annex land north of the 49th parallel? And that's what the quick arrangement where the British got their colonies to come together and create the Dominion. So there is a lot of, as I said, ruin behind this thing. But the point is, the Monroe Doctrine clearly laid the grounds that a foreign power coming into Western Hemisphere and in any way it is perceived as a threat. And in this case, it was a threat. The deployment of nuclear missiles in Cuba was a threat into the heartland of America, 90 miles south of Florida. And we know what happened. He drew the lines, the quarantine, the Soviet vessels turned around, and then diplomacy came in, and the Turkish deployment was taken down, and the Soviets withdrew from Cuba, So what is so difficult to understand for anyone that there are red lines when we are dealing with great powers, and the red line was crossed. I mean, the Moscow, whether it is Putin or whether it had been Yeltsin or whether it had been somebody else now, they would not take it kindly what's been played out in Ukraine. By the way, I must also mention this. This problem of Ukraine is not something that erupted in February of 2022.
No.
It was all set into motion in 2014, and we can go even further back. I mean, the color revolution and that took place in 2014, when an elected government that everybody conceded was fair under the circumstances, that is the election of Viktor Yanukovych, who was pro-Moscow in the sense that he understood the red line of Moscow, yep, and basically was not going to allow you to take Ukraine into the NATO, was overthrown by a coup, which is the color revolution, by a coup engineered by United States.
I think John McCain had quite a bit to do.
John McCain was there, but the key player was the Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, and Victoria Nuland is back again. Yes. In the same capacity, doing the same thing. So this is the play that is going on, and the point about this color revolution, this is one world order, this is globalism, is that the color revolution was, the laboratory was Ukraine. Before Ukraine, it was Georgia, where they had another color revolution that was the Rose Revolution in, I think it was in 2003 or 2005, something like that. But it was in Bush administration. I have to go and check the dates. But the foreign minister of Gorbachev, and therefore who was involved in glasnost and perestroika, and then the dismantling of Soviet Union in 1991, was Edward Shevardnadze. And Edward Shevardnadze had gone back to his home republic, which had now become independent, Georgia. He was the president of Georgia when the Rose Revolution happened. That is, again, an orchestrated public movement, popular movement, led by, again, highly dubious character in terms of the money flow that took place. He had his base in America, Mikhail Saakashvili, and Edward Shevardnadze was overthrown. But Georgia is another red line, because again, Putin was there. He was the president in Moscow, just as he was a president in 2014. And he was reminding that these are red lines.
We had the other, it seems like an ongoing playbook. I mean, we had, it wasn't too long ago, we had Kazakhstan was facing down its own.
Very recently.
What you could say was a color revolution as well.
Color revolution, but Russ, what is most interesting is the color revolution. These were the laboratory has now been executed in America. That was the 2020 election.
Yes.
And then the whole thing, in the Congress, the January 6th insurrection that has been, created, fabricated to indict everybody in America. So
we got to talk about that in another day, because that is a topic that deserves its own little interview. I'll tell you.
That's right.
But I think what I'd like to say is that we have all this historical precedence. We have people who are supposed to be smart people in our governments to understand these historical happenings and precedents. Red lines, they're supposed to know what a red line is. What is Canada doing? Because Canada, up until very recently, up until maybe 10 years ago or so, was the Middle Kingdom, was the peacekeeper, was the negotiator. Canada would be the country that would come in and say, hey, look, can't we have a talk? Can't we have an off-ramp here and everybody saves face and go home? And we're the guys that put the peacekeepers in Suez there under Pearson. What is happening? Because now Canada is it seems like they're chomping at the bit to give lethal weapons to Ukraine, give Kalashnikovs to grandmothers, and go send them against Russian tanks. There's no talk of any kind of compromise or any kind of negotiation. What happened? Why is Canada doing this?
Well, the quick answer would be that in the 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union and the bipolar world, what we have entered into the unipolar world, the world globalist agenda. Of course, United States is on the lead, and now we know one of the things that has happened over the last few years, that is the Trump administration, the whole deep state swamp has been exposed. We now know that there is a deep state in a manner in which we did not know, as when President Eisenhower warned just before leaving office in his last address to the nation, the farewell address in 61, January 61, about the military-industrial complex, coming from the man who was the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe.
Yes.
One of the greatest generals.
And you're saying that Canada has been subsumed by this global enterprise, this
exactly.
new global network.
We have been totally penetrated by that. So I mean, that's the thing. And here is the irony. I mean, everything that you have pointed out, but the great irony is that your parents' generation, as my parents and grandparents' generation, who fought for the empire, over 2 million Indians fought for the empire, both on the Japanese sector, against Japan, and against Germany. I mean, the great battles like the Battle of El Alamein, the manpower was from India in Montgomery's 8th Army that defeated Rommel in Africa, Corps in Africa.
Yes.
And the same thing, you know, on the Japanese front. So 2 million Indians, Canadians in such numbers, and who laid their life for the empire. And who was the empire fighting? Including the Soviet Union. They were part of the Great Alliance against the Nazis.
The fascists,
and who are we standing up with? Who is our government and our prime ministers are boasting about? There is no opposition in Ottawa that can stand up and speak truth to power, which is the role of the opposition.
Yes.
You know, there is none on both sides, and the same thing in America, Republican, Democrat, the rhinos. So who are we standing up for? There it is, the picture. The deputy prime minister going out in rallies with the Ukrainian people, holding the flag and the colors of Stephen Bandera, the neo-Nazi leader, the ally of Hitler. I
think for our audience, Salim, I think Stepan Bandera was a Ukrainian nationalist, World War II. He collaborated with the Nazis against the Soviets, and was him and his ONU, I forget what it stands for. Basically, it's a nationalist party of Ukraine type thing. Were responsible for many deaths, for many Jewish deaths, and transportations off to the gas camps of Nazi Germany. But yes, that is absolutely an incredible connection there, because I believe our deputy prime minister's grandfather, on her mother's side, I believe, was associated with the Nazi movement in Ukraine. That was responsible for many of these same atrocities. And it just strikes me as ironic, really ironic, that, you know, we had that freedom convoy in Ottawa, and I think one chap was with a Nazi swastika on it, and the whole freedom convoy got painted with that brush, that fascist brush. And here we have this other situation, these connections with Ukraine, but no one utters a peep. It seems rather ironic and odd. But
it is more than ironic, and we got everything upside down. But Russ, moving forward, what is happening after all the smoke and fire and the ruin that accompanies smoke and fire settles, to the extent that the fog lifts and we see through the fog? What has happened is the Americans have basically pushed Russia and China together in now consolidating what is the famous heartland theory, you know, going back to Mackinder. Whoever controls the heartland will control the world island, that is the 3 continent that converges. Asia, Eurasia, that's the heartland, and Africa, will control between half to three-quarter of the world resources. And of course, the population in terms of markets, I mean, the two largest population, China and India, the whole Pacific Rim and so on. So this is the unintended consequences. And when Athens and Sparta went at each other, when the dust settled, Philip of Macedonia conquered Greece, and his son launched the conquest of the world.
Yes. Isn't that rather odd? And isn't it rather fitting that in the last United Nations vote on censoring Russia, we had China, India, and United Arab Emirates abstaining? That speaks to that heartland concept that you've just brought forward.
Exactly. And with India, what we can see is the association of what came into play over the last decade: BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's the heartland.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to come together because in another direction, in another tangent, this conflict is between the globalists in the world, led by the World Economic Forum and its control through the European Union and NATO with American. By the way, the Democrat Party has not completely disclosed itself. It is the war party in America.
Yes. Yeah. But we see that things are coming to it seems like things are coming to a bit of a head here with this heartland forming up, with it coming up against this globalist empire. You mentioned
yes,
the World Economic Forum, the American aspect. And at the end of the day, when the dust settles, I mean, we're going to be in a different world, I think, aren't we? We're going to be in a very different world where
you'll be
maybe things like the American dollar as being the reserve currency of the world, maybe that is under a bit of threat here as Russia and China come together, because I believe they're already talking about having an alternative to the present reserve currency. So that is very interesting to ponder upon.
Yeah, I mean, when the dust settled after the end of Second World War, 1945, the last two standing empires that had survived World War I, that is the British and the French, that was over. Yeah. Even though the illusion of an empire carried on for a decade or more, but the final insult or humiliation of rule Britannica came about as a result of Colonel Nasser. Colonel Nasser nationalizing the Suez Canal, and Mr. Eden, Anthony Eden, Prime Minister, conservative, who had been the foreign minister for Churchill during the war, thought it was still rule Britannica, that he would raise his finger and he would get Nasser to withdraw.
Yes.
But that was the end of it. That was the humiliation of Britain, and it was the end of it. And for the French, the humiliation and end came approximately at the same time, 2 years earlier, at Dien Bien Phu in Indochina.
Yes.
And remember, President Eisenhower did not take America into Indochina. That was left to Lyndon Johnson with the fake, false construct of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. It was as much of a lie as there has been lies now that has been disclosed. The WMD issue, whether Saddam was a bad guy and needed to be removed. And many of us supported that. I supported the removal of Saddam Hussein. Yeah. But the construct that was provided, the platform on which the argument was made, was all turned out to be a big hoax, Yes. And then we have seen what has happened again with similar construct that was provided in the removal of the Libyan leader, Muammar Gaddafi, in Africa, that led to the disaster. I mean, Gaddafi was not a good guy, but Gaddafi was fighting against Al-Qaeda. Yeah. So this is a mess. But the point I'm driving at, when this dust settles, America will possibly be as diminished in some ways as Britain was diminished, and then Britain lost its control after the end of World War II. So the unintended consequences, again, back to Thucydides, the unintended consequences is what plays out in history, because whatever is the intended consequence gets consummated in the play itself. So Sparta and Athens fought it out for supremacy in Greece. Whatever was the intended consequence, Sparta defeated Athens at the end of the Peloponnesian War. But both the parties had become so weakened that the Macedonians prevailed, came from outside, took over Greece, and the rest is history. Same over here we are seeing, you know, the two world wars that happened in the last century. George Kennan was so perceptive because he was a historian, and he was a man who was at the scene, engaged with these people. So the question was not to make enemy of Russia. The question was, Russia from the time of Peter the Great has looked to the West. Here was an opportunity to build the bridges to Russia and help Russia achieve its transformation into a democracy that it was trying to do. Instead, what they have ended up doing is to reconsolidating Russian relationship with China.
Okay, Salim, that's kind of an amazing statement, you know, to realize that there was an opportunity up front to have some sort of a reconciliation between East and West, and then see that evaporate as I guess one global empire rose up against another. And I think what we'll do here is leave it at that point, and perhaps continue these discussions at a later date. Anyway, thanks so much, Salim, for your participation. It's been a real pleasure to have you with us today. Thanks and goodbye.